15 years ago, my wife and I, Kim, went on our honeymoon. And some people in town gave us some money so we could go to a place I'd never heard of called the Abacos in the Bahamas. And one of the things early in our marriage was I didn't really know how to vacation because my family didn't really do that. I remember like the big vacation my dad took us on was he took me of a spring break to Kentucky to see the statue of a dead horse named Manowar. And he's like, "Isn't this cool?" I'm like, that was what my family did. Or like when I think Kim, right, she went on fancy things like cruises sometimes. But so we go to the Abacos, and I have no clue how to act. And here are just some of the things that I did. I've grown up a little bit since then, not much. But I remember her getting ready to go to the beach, and she got like all her gear, and you have a golf cart there because there's not cars. And I realized quickly that her plan was to go sit at one place at the beach and not move. Right? Like till Jesus returned, she's just going to sit there and kind of flip from side to side. I thought, that's what we're doing, right? We came here to do that. And so I didn't know what to do. I was like a little puppy on the island, so I just started going, like looking at shells and trying to meet new friends, and because I didn't know how to vacation. I remember one of the things I did, I met the guy who was like the mayor and owned the store and was also the preacher at the Methodist church, and I thought, let's set up a mission trip because you got to do mission in the Abacos, and so that'd be a great thing to bring our youth group over there. I remember being on the phone trying to set up a bone fishing trip. It was like over a half-day bone fishing trip by myself. Like I didn't think about including my wife. We married like 2 days. I'm like, this is a great idea. But then the one Kim will tell you about, and she remembers, is as we were walking down this path, it was like the most romantic evening. And there's like a lit path. We'd had a great dinner. I even know what we had, lobster bisque. I mean, this was nice. And for some reason, as she says, I just kind of veered off as we're romantically walking towards our cabana thingy that looked over the water. I veered off to the left to some other part of the little resort because I thought my new best friend who I'd met that morning named George would be there so he could tell me how to catch a lobster. You think I'm kidding? Like, I'm not. I'm like, that's a great idea, right? You're with your wife and married 2 days. Go hang out with a stranger. Because I just thought I would love to catch a lobster. And, I'm sure Kim was crying herself to sleep in her bed. We were married 2 days. Here's the truth of it is I didn't know how to vacation. I didn't know how to be married, obviously. But I did know how to rest. It's something I've had to grow my whole life in is what does it look like to really rest? And I don't mean just kind of take a nap, but I mean in your soul, what does it look like to really rest? And I think for a lot of my life, even though I've worked really in the church my whole life, I've been like that infant. For those that have had children or have children, when you're begging your kid, would you just go to sleep, right? Like, don't come out of your room again. Just please shut your eyes. Parents begging kids to sleep, which I never thought as a parent I'd ever beg a kid to eat or sleep. No one begs me to do that. But that's kind of what I'm like. I think I'm like an infant who God's like, rest, stop. And so my guess is some of you probably are a little bit like me. And I'm going to be a little bit more serious. I actually think constant busyness in our culture is an addiction. And I think people go on vacations to detox, and they really can't. And they can't let go. They can't unplug because we're used to going for months and months and months, 90 miles an hour, and then we just throw it in park and say, now I'm on vacation. And we never kind of unwind. And so I've had to learn a lot of things about time away. What does it look like? So in my mind, I had to do this thing so my wife and I could have better communication about when I'm not working. So here's what I came up with in my mind, and it kind of works. There are 3 different times of time for me: vacation, visiting, and rest. All 3 are different. So vacation, let me give you an example, and I learned this now that we have young kids. When you go on vacation and you come back, you are exhausted and poor. But, right, like Disneyland, for some reason I thought, well, go to Disneyland and I'll come back and be so rejuvenated. I'm like, oh my gosh, I walked 100 miles in 2 days. But vacation is not restful to me, but it was great for our family. We just went to Williamsburg, and my wife, from like 3 in the morning till midnight, she had us looking at every plaque in Williamsburg and Jamestown. I can tell you about Pocahontas and how to shoot a musket, and I can tell you all those things. But we come back exhausted, but it was good for our family. And then visiting, I was really not good at this. We'd go be with Kim's family, and I would just go find a fishing rod and go fish in the neighborhood pond. and thinking, oh, we've come here to visit with our family. I had to learn what it means to visit. But then for me, I had to learn something about rest, and this is just kind of my deal. For Nate Stratman to rest, I love my children, but they can't be around. There can't be a schedule. There can't be a program. I really just need to unwind, which is harder for me. But if I don't do it, and you all know this, if you don't unplug, something breaks, right? Everything works better a little bit if you unplug it. Have you noticed that? And when we unplug, I realize there's a connection there that I need to have, and it makes me healthier. So, what do we do to get rest for the soul? Because some people believe if you just go on vacation, you'll be rested. And maybe for a second, but not your soul. Like, what do you do for your soul to find rest? Well, I think I have found the secret sauce, my friends. Psalm 23, the most famous psalm we know, I believe gets to the core issue of a culture that's addicted to busy. And I will be honest with you, many pastors have not been good examples to churches about busyness. And so I'm on this journey with many of you of what does it mean to slow down a bit. And not just like read a blog of like 3 quick things to declutter your schedule. I'm saying let's do something at the root that causes us to rest. And Psalm 23 does that for me. Now many people say, oh, that's the funeral verse, right? So when you go to a funeral, what do you hear? Psalm 23. But Psalm 23 is a verse for the living. It's a chapter for living. I would say it's a chapter of great confidence. And so I want to read it to you. This is a little bit different of a translation, but I want to read this to you because I think it'll be helpful. And as a thought I had this morning, for my feet to slow down and Nate Stratman's mind to slow down, my heart and my soul have to slow down. It's my heart and soul that has to slow down first, and then my feet, my mind will slow down. And this verse helps me. The Lord is my shepherd, and this translation says, I lack nothing. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Stop for a second. David was just using a sheep and shepherd metaphor, where he's the sheep, God's the shepherd, and then he switches and uses a different metaphor. He uses a host and guest metaphor. And he says, God, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, each week, we're going to kind of go through a different verse in here. But when I read this, I hear the confidence of David. I hear the fact that there's great dependence in God from David. And the last thing is, which I really think, whether you know it or not, I think you're seeking this. I am too. Contentment. I think David has found deep contentment in Jesus, in God. And I don't think it's always been true for him. So, just so you know, tonight I'm preaching one verse. In this one verse, verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. That is 2 claims that David makes that I think we could actually spend several weeks on. But the first idea I think I see in this that will be helpful for us is that rest is connected to our confidence in who God is. Now let me unpack that for a second. Your rest, your ability to deeply rest, is connected to the confidence you have in who God is. So for instance, David has this confidence where he says, the Lord is my shepherd. He's mine. A lot of the names of God were kind of these distant gods, where God was a distant God. And he's saying, no, he's my God. And then he names him, he gives him this name, shepherd, which David knows well. What was David's job? As shepherd. When we met him, he was tending sheep. David knows everything there is to know what it takes to watch sheep. Now, let me ask you a question. There are actually a family in our church that has sheep. The Risleys have a couple sheep. But most of y'all probably don't know much about sheep. Do you know, like in like the Middle East right now, there's shepherds everywhere. Do you know what a sheep needs from a shepherd? Everything. Everything. They're different than any other animal in that way. They are dependent 100% on the shepherd. Have you ever seen a wild sheep? Right? You know, you don't see sheep, they're like, woohoo! You know, they're out on their own and like, we're independent. No, they're like, bah, where are my friends? You know, and They all want to stay together, and they kind of huddle together, and they always look like they're scared to death. Now, when David uses this metaphor, the Lord is my shepherd, think of what he's saying. He's talking about this different role that the shepherd has. So one of them is that, and you'll read this in Psalm 23, the shepherd actually has to show them where the food is. And he has to make them lie down and eat, and he has to show them where to drink, like what part of the stream. Because if the water is too ripply, the sheep are like, whoa, that's too crazy. They need quiet waters, right? So they can drink deeply. And then they have to be told to rest. And then another thing is they're completely, like, what is the defense mechanism of a sheep? Yeah, they don't have some secret power. Their defense mechanism is the shepherd. We read stories of David where he defended the sheep against bears and other big animals. That's part of what a shepherd does. It's not a glorious job. It was actually the lowest of the totem pole, and yet David is saying, the Lord is my shepherd, the one who protects me, the one who feeds me. The other thing that sheep do is they flip on their back often. Do you know what happens to a sheep when he's on his back? He gets dirty, but he dies. Yeah. He dies. And so one thing the shepherd has to do is constantly flipping these little sheep back onto their feet so they can go again. But my favorite thing a shepherd does is when a sheep gets lost. And a lot of times this is how a sheep gets lost. And some of us, you can kind of make the jump of how you have been lost in this life, because a sheep will just nibble its way out of the pasture and look up one day and think, where am I? Right? I'm completely away from the flock, from the fold of God. How did I get out here? What does the great shepherd do? Goes and finds the sheep. So, back to confidence. Why is David so confident? The Lord is my shepherd? Because if you know about David, and we've gone through a series of David, it's because David is a sheep and he knows what it's like for someone to seek him out and find him in the wild when he's lost. He knows what it's like in the depth of his soul when he's flipped over on his back to be flipped back on his feet. God did that. He knows what it's like to have deep rest because God did that for him. So all these things, when he's saying, the Lord is my shepherd, this is what David is talking about. He's remembering the benefits of God. So let me give you a little thing that has helped me. When I lack the ability to rest deeply in who God is, I can tell you what's probably going on. I've forgotten his benefits. You know what I mean? I've forgotten like the benefits we get from being children of God. And what David is saying is, listen to these benefits. If the Lord is our shepherd, there's incredible benefits. We lack nothing when the Lord is our shepherd. When's the last time you've thought about the benefits of God in your life? But then the next thing I would say after this idea that rest comes from confidence, but confidence, when we have great confidence in who God is, and we're growing in that then we can have dependence. And you hear this dependence, you can actually depend in who God is. Trust God with your life, not just have these ideas about God, but actually depend on God to kind of follow through. Now, how did David have such deep dependence at this point on God? Here's my thought. Because for so long he tried to be independent. If you know the story of David, David basically said, I'm going to do it my way. And if you think of like the way we come in this world, we were just talking about this. You come in this world 100% dependent on parents. Right? So when Megan and Tanner have this child, it will come out like a sheep. It won't be a sheep, but 100%. Megan went, wow! No, 100% dependent on them. And then when they get a little older, what do? Right? They get independent. But when we become independent, does that mean we're independent this way? But sometimes that happens. We say, no, I don't need God. And so what David did, here's the big mistake David made that a lot of us can make, I've made, is we forget that we start to think we're the shepherd, not the sheep. We actually start to think that we're in control of our lives. We actually start to act like we're God. Now, we would never say that, but we start to act like we're God and we have it all under control. Do you know what that did for David? Let me remind you a couple things. I know we've talked about this earlier in the year. Adultery, murder. David was one who, when it came to his daughter and his son, was not a very good father. And because of all this kind of madness, awful things that no father would ever want to happen to their daughter or their son, happened to him. There's this line in the Psalms that says, where David says, my tears were my food. Why? Because David was trying to be the shepherd and not the sheep. David was trying to take everything into his own control, and he kind of got to the end. Now, I think I've shared this quote with you all before, but it's one of my favorites. Corrie ten Boom was famous for housing Jews, and then during the Holocaust, she got in trouble for that and then was put essentially in an internment camp. And she had this line that I think sums up David, and I would say has summed up my spiritual walk. She said, you may never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. Some of us will never know that Jesus is all we need until there's nothing else, until Jesus is all we have. This is where David wound up. He had nothing. He had lost everything except for God. Some of you, like me, are Davids. You've learned that way. Almost everything has to be taken away to realize that God is our shepherd, that God is dependable. But I want to remind us of something. I think something can happen, especially if we've been Christians for a while. We forget our sheepiness, right? In this whole little paradigm, you are the sheep. I know it's not flattering, but the truth is that this guy up here winds up on his back sometimes, and I need God to put me back on my hooves, right? That sometimes I need God to show me where to rest and where to eat and show me where the good food is. I need that too. And in our culture, it's almost like it's a bad thing to say we're fully dependent on God because we want to be independent. Folks, the strongest thing you'll ever do is admit you're weak and be fully dependent on God. That's the strongest move, I believe, that you can ever make. For me, as I thought about in my life where I haven't depended on God, I have not been confident. But recently in our move here, and I know I bring this up a lot, but it was just one of those moments where we were in Colorado. We loved Colorado. We loved the church. We loved everything about it, but God was stirring something. We weren't shooed out of Colorado, but I started thinking about, and I had this beautiful moment as we talked about coming here and starting a church. And in my mind, I was kind of doing the worst case scenario thing. Does anyone do that, like before you make a decision, like, what's the worst thing that could happen? So that's what I'm doing. I didn't do this with my wife, but I'm like writing it down, like, what's the worst case scenario? Okay, no one comes to the church. That's pretty much, okay, which means no one puts anything in the basket because there are no baskets because there's not a church. So where do we live? How much do I get paid? And all those things that bring us comfort, salary, 403B, 501K, college savings, all those things that make us feel so comfortable. I had to say, but what if I can't have any of those things? Do I still depend on God? I'm not always like this, but without a doubt in my soul, I felt, yeah, take all those things away. I'll go work some other job. It doesn't mean it'll be fun, but let's do this. And here's what happened when I fully depended on God. And as Tanner was saying, like, sometimes you just got to go. And so we went, and we've been figuring this thing out as we've gone. God's provisions have been unreal. But let me tell you what happens. When you fully depend on God, you experience a freedom like you've never experienced before. And here's what happens when you experience that freedom. You rest, right? If you think God is dependable, which we have a good track record, I have dropped the ball a lot with God. He's never dropped the ball. And so we have this great thing going on here. But when he is 100% dependable in your mind, you can go to sleep at night even when you're not sure where your next paycheck is coming from. That, to me, is an exciting part of what I think I hear David saying. That rest comes out of this great, like when we can depend that God has it, we can actually find deeper rest. And the last thing I see in this is if you're fully dependent on God, even though if you don't know what tomorrow looks like, that's when you experience contentment. Do you know what it's like to feel content? I mean, like we're really content. Regardless, it doesn't mean everything's going your way. It means actually when things aren't going your way, you still have a peace in your soul about what's going on in your life. Now listen to the second claim David makes. The first is, the Lord is my shepherd, confidence, dependence. And the second claim he says, I lack nothing. I lack nothing. Well, how does he say that? I think he's looking at God and he's saying, okay, I look around and God provides food, God provides water, God provides salvation, God provides identity, God provides purpose, God gives me a name. I mean, all these things David's saying, this is what God does. What else is there that I really need? What a great place to be. He's content as he's realizing that God provides all these things. As you all know, I love quotes, and I especially love to quote dead theologians. But one of my favorite is Augustine. And here's one of the things that he says that I think is helpful. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in thee. God has made us, wired us for him. But maybe some of you all felt this way, that you have a restless heart. And I think you have a restless heart, or I've had a restless heart, because we're trying to find comfort and purpose in all these other things. Relationships, finances, health. And as all of you know, relationships, even the ones you trust the most, can go up and down. As all of you know, finances go up and down. As all of you know, health goes up and down, doesn't it? But we ultimately find rest when we put our heart or find rest in God. The second person I wanted to quote, John Calvin, another dead theologian I love, but he said something that I think is interesting, and it's true about me. He said the human heart is an idol factory. The human heart is an idol factory. Now think about this. It's like our heart just kind of makes up these things that we will worship. And sometimes we can look at them and the culture would say that's not a bad thing. But like I've said this before, but sometimes we can worship our own children. Like it's like if you have children, they can be the most important thing, or our jobs, or our image, or our finances, or the appearance of what our relationships or things look like, our job, all these things. But at the end of the day, those idols, which for this metaphor I'm going to call false shepherds. For some of us, those become false shepherds. At the end of the day, do you know what they do? They are thieves of contentment. They actually rob your contentment. So if you are comparing yourself to other people, that's a thief of contentment. You'll never be content if you're trying to have someone else's situation. If you're trying to say, I just want people to believe we have the best marriage in the world, or I'm the healthiest person in the world, or I have everything together, and you're trying to live out that image, that will be a thief of contentment. And the truth is, and I think one of the things I think about is that if God is truly our shepherd, then let's talk about money, which money is a thing that so much we can be so dependent on money. But if God is truly our shepherd, then what does that mean money is? If it's not our shepherd, money is a gift from God. It's a gift from God. So we can hold it a little looser. It doesn't define us. And so if it's a gift from God, then you can give it to people who are in need, and it's okay. And when it goes up and goes down, you're still the same person. You're still a child of God. But if it is your God, then when it goes up and goes down, it really starts to mess with who you are. But as you read on in the Psalm, when David talks about being in the valley of shadow of death, money doesn't help us very much when we're in the valley of the shadow of death, does it? It doesn't do anything. You can't buy your way out of darkness. But Jesus says, no, I go there. I enter into the darkness with you and walk with you into that valley. I was in Jerusalem a couple years ago, or 5 years ago, and it was an interesting experience. The tour group was kind of done, and I went out, and it was Shabbat. It was Saturday. It was the Sabbath. And Jerusalem just shuts down. I mean, it's like everything. Maybe how this country used to be, 75 years ago, 50 years ago. But it just shuts down because it's the Sabbath. It's Shabbat. And so I started walking through a Hasidic Jewish neighborhood. It's like, if you don't know who they are, they're like hardcore Jewish folk, right? And so I'm walking through the neighborhood on the Shabbat, and it was the most beautiful thing. Almost every window, I could look into the window, which sounds creepy that I'm walking in a random neighborhood looking in windows. But you could see candles lit for Shabbat at sundown. And families gathered around, and you could see the Torah out as the family, all ages, are reading and remembering the goodness of God. And I just looked in there, and it was a time in my life where I just felt tired in my soul, and I thought, I could sense the contentment. As everything just shut down, there's some candles, and people were remembering the goodness of God, young and old, single, married. It was a powerful thing. And here's what I've had to learn, because I haven't always been great at this. I'm growing in it. This is what rest says to God. When you truly rest, and I don't mean just take a nap, but I mean truly rest in God, it says, I trust you. It says, I trust you. Because the opposite is true. If we're nonstop working and doing everything, what does that say? God, I got this, right? I'm in control. But when we rest, what you're saying to God is, I trust you. I want to encourage you this month as we start kind of looking through Psalm 23. I don't know what it looks like for you to pray, but I encourage you to pray kind of a verse at a time. So just this week, just pray and ponder and marinate on this statement. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. Because here's what I love about Psalm 23. It's a great invitation. It's an invitation to a new way of living. Because the truth is, even some of you that are retired, and even young kids will say, you look at them, they're exhausted. Our schedules have been overwhelming. And it's almost when you read this, there's a new way of doing life that God shows us. There's a similar invitation in the New Testament, and I want to close with this, that Jesus offers his sheep. And I want you to listen to these words. I'm going to explain them in just a second. But I remember that my wife put a part of this verse in our window at one point in our first house. And it was a point where I just felt tired in my soul, and I read these words, and I started to cry like a baby. Because they were such inviting words that I needed to hear that Jesus says to his sheep. And maybe you've heard them before. Matthew 11, he says this. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. That word yoke, we don't use it much. Do you all know what a yoke is between two ox? It's that wooden thing that keeps two together, and they pull a plow. So when they would hear the word yoke, one thing they were thinking of as the expression of the yoke of the law in the Old Testament was that the way the Pharisees were doing faith was that it was all about all these rules. And it was very judgmental, and there was no grace there. There was little compassion there. And everyone was making sure everyone just followed these rules. And Jesus says that yoke is oppressive. That's not the way of God. He says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so part of the image is if you were to put a yoke over two big animals that were pulling a plow, often you'd put an experienced one and an inexperienced one together. Now imagine what happens. They both have this wooden thing over their neck, and the inexperienced one or the younger one is probably taking off super fast and slowing down and dragging his feet and sitting down and having an attitude. But it's hooked to the experienced one who sets the pace. And eventually, after time of this one trying to do it its own way, realizes the pace of the experienced one, and they become equally yoked. What a great image of us and Jesus. That we're yoked to him and we understand his rhythm and his pace, because the rhythm of God, the rhythm of Christ, is life-giving, and it leads to contentment. Amen. I needed to hear those words. If no one else heard these words tonight, I've just preached to myself. But as we leave this place, my prayer is this, wherever you are in your faith, that you would have greater confidence in who God is, that you would depend more on who God is, fully depend on him, and that I pray that you would have a type of contentment that you've never experienced before, only offered in Christ, that you would know a deep contentment. And my prayer for all of us is that you would know to the bottom of your soul that the Lord is your shepherd and that in him you lack nothing. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this psalm of life, the psalm of confidence and dependence. And God, maybe for some of us life looks kind of like it's all together on the outside, but on the inside we might say we are not content. And God, I pray that we would be a church that would find deep contentment, even though the world around us sometimes feels like it's falling apart, that we'd find deep contentment regardless of situations in you and in you alone, that you would be our shepherd, and we would allow you to lead us and feed us and flip us back on our feet and protect us, because it's what you want to do. God, we're grateful, and we're remembering this day the benefits of what it means to be sheep. We pray this in the strong name of Jesus, and all God's people said, amen.